somewhere in the green farmland of central Switzerland, on a grey January morning in 1975, a one-armed farmer walked out of his modest home and looked up at the sky. What he saw next, or what he claimed to see, would set in motion one of the most documented, most debated, and most deliberately obscured contact events in the history of the modern world. His name was Edward Albert Meier. The world would come to know him simply as Billy. And if the documents buried inside Cold War intelligence archives are to be believed, documents that analysts were never supposed to find, what happened on that hillside was not a hallucination, not a hoax, and not a weather phenomenon. It was the beginning of something so significant that 3 separate Western intelligence agencies quietly moved to ensure the public would never take it seriously. This is not the story of whether Billy Meier was telling the truth. This is the story of why the truth, whatever it was, had to be controlled. Tonight we go deep into one of the most extraordinary cases ever assembled. A case where the photographs were too good, the witnesses too credible, and the official silence too perfectly coordinated to be anything other than deliberate. Find a comfortable position. The lights are low, and somewhere above the Swiss Alps something is still waiting. The canton of Zurich sits in the northern heart of Switzerland, a landscape of ordered fields, dense pine forests, and villages that have existed nearly unchanged for hundreds of years. The people here are known for precision and privacy. They do not, as a cultural rule, invent stories. Hinwil was, in 1975, a small agricultural settlement roughly 40 kilometres southeast of Zurich. Population, modest. Industry, farming, and light manufacture. The kind of place where strangers were noticed immediately, and where unusual events, if they occurred at all, spread through the community in hours. Eduard Meier was 40 years old that January. He had been born in 1937 in the village of Bulach, the son of a cobbler. His childhood was unremarkable except for one recurring theme that would define his entire adult life. He claimed, from the age of 5, to have experienced periodic contact with non-human intelligence. These early claims, which Meier documented in personal notebooks, were dismissed by family and neighbours as the fantasies of an imaginative child. But Meier was persistent in a way that imagination alone rarely sustains across decades. By the time he reached adulthood, he had travelled extensively. He had lived in India, Turkey, and across Central Europe. He had worked manual labour, lost his left arm in a bus accident in Turkey in 1965, and returned to Switzerland with a young wife, Calliope, known to friends as Poppy, and a growing family. He was, by any external measurement, an unlikely candidate for international controversy. That changed on the morning of January 28, 1975. According to Meier's own account, written in careful, methodical detail that same day, he had received an internal impression, which he described as a form of mental signal or telepathic notification, that he should travel to a specific location in the fields outside Hinwil. This was not, he emphasised, unusual for him. He claimed such impressions had been occurring for years, though with increasing frequency and clarity since 1973. He drove his moped to the location indicated. He was alone. What he documented upon arrival has been analysed, disputed, replicated, attacked, and quietly studied by aerospace engineers, intelligence analysts, photographic experts, and researchers across 4 decades and more than a dozen countries. He saw a disc-shaped metallic craft hovering without sound at low altitude above the field. He described it as approximately 7 meters in diameter with a domed upper section and a flattened lower hull. The surface appeared to be a brushed metal, not reflective like polished aluminum, but luminous in a way that seemed to emanate light rather than reflect it. The air around the craft was completely still. No displaced wind, no engine noise, no sound of any kind that he could place against any existing reference point in his experience. And standing beside the craft, or perhaps emerging from it, he was never entirely certain, was a figure he would describe in subsequent writings as Semjase. Semjase, he wrote, was a woman, or appeared to be. She stood approximately 160 centimetres tall, slightly above average for a Swiss woman of that era. Her features were fine-boned and symmetrical. Her clothing was a one-piece silver-grey suit without visible seams. Her hair was long and a pale blonde. Her eyes were large, widely spaced, and of a colour that Meier struggled to describe in his native German, eventually settling on a term that translates roughly as deep blue gold. They communicated, he said, through a process that was partly verbal. She spoke a language that he did not recognise but somehow understood, and partly what he could only describe as direct thought transfer. Ideas arrived in his mind fully formed, bypassing his ears entirely. The content of what was communicated covered topics that Meier, a farmer with a basic education, could not have been expected to address with any fluency. Orbital mechanics, planetary geology, the history of civilizational development across timescales that dwarfed human recorded history, and, most pressingly, a series of specific warnings about the trajectory on which Earth's civilization was currently travelling. The encounter lasted, by his estimate, approximately 40 minutes. When he returned home that afternoon, he sat down and wrote 14 pages of notes. He drew diagrams. He sketched the craft from multiple angles. He recorded the content of what had been communicated with the systematic thoroughness of a man who understood, even in those first hours, that he was going to need to prove something that most people would instinctively refuse to believe. The following day, he went back, with a camera. Between January of 1975 and the late months of 1978, Eduard Meier took a series of photographs that have never been satisfactorily explained away. This is not a subjective claim. It is a matter of documented forensic history. He shot initially on a 35mm film camera, a standard consumer-grade device available to any Swiss household of the era. He later acquired a Polaroid camera, which he used for a smaller number of images, the photographs number in the hundreds. The most analysed of them, the ones that have been studied under computer enhancement, photogrammetric analysis, spectral light modelling, and multiple independent forensic reviews, show a consistent, physically coherent object in genuine aerial suspension. That last phrase matters enormously. Genuine aerial suspension. When investigators in the late 1970s began applying what were then cutting-edge photographic analysis techniques, borrowed from satellite imagery processing developed for the space race, they were looking specifically for evidence of models on strings, for evidence of objects attached to poles or wires, for evidence of double exposure or darkroom manipulation. They found none. The shadow geometry was consistent across photographs taken at different times of day, meaning the light source was not artificial, and the object was not a small model held close to the lens. The parallax relationships between the object and background landscape elements confirmed that the craft was, in the images, genuinely distant from the camera, not a few centimetres away on a string, but many metres away in open air. One analysis, conducted by a former aerospace imaging consultant who asked not to be named in publications, noted that the reflective properties of the craft's surface changed correctly between images as the craft rotated, something that would require extraordinary expertise to fake with a physical model and would be effectively impossible to fabricate through standard darkroom technique of that era. Remember, this is 1975, 1976, 1977. There is no desktop computer. There is no software capable of image manipulation that would be accessible to a Swiss farmer. Consumer digital cameras are 2 decades away. If Billy Meier faked these photographs, he did so using techniques that professional special effects studios of the era could not have matched without months of work and substantial resource investment. His farm showed no evidence of such equipment. His finances showed no capacity for it, and witnesses in the surrounding community reported seeing Meier at or near the locations depicted, alone, with his small camera, on ordinary Swiss afternoons. The photographs spread first through European research networks, loose communities of scientists, military veterans, and independent investigators who had been quietly cataloguing aerial anomaly reports since the early 1950s. Many of these individuals were former military or intelligence-adjacent professionals. They were not, as a group, credulous people. Their response to the Meier photographs was striking in its caution. Where they might have expected to dismiss the images in minutes, they found themselves writing careful, hedged memos to one another, noting that the imagery was more consistent with an actual aerial object than with any known fabrication method available to a civilian in rural Switzerland. That caution, that careful, professional reluctance to simply laugh the thing away, is itself a data point worth holding in mind as this investigation unfolds. Within months of the initial photographs circulating through European research circles, something changed in the quiet landscape around Hinwil. Local residents, dairy farmers, retired school teachers, a road crew working on a bridge project 3 kilometres from Meier's property, began noticing vehicles they did not recognise. Not the beaten farm trucks and family sedans of the canton, clean vehicles, often dark-coloured, parked for long periods in positions that offered clear sightlines to the fields Meier frequented. A postal worker named Hans, whose surname has been withheld in every published account of this period, told investigators years later that he had seen, on at least 4 separate occasions between spring and autumn of 1975, what appeared to be observation equipment set up on a hillside overlooking one of Meier's documented contact locations. Tripod-mounted, professional-grade, operated by individuals dressed in ordinary civilian clothing who responded to his wave with silence and expressionless stares. The Swiss Federal Police, when asked about unusual activity in the Hinwil region during this period, stated publicly that no investigations had been initiated and no reports had been filed. This is technically accurate. Which is interesting, because technically accurate is not the same as completely true. No Swiss investigation had been initiated. That much appears to be genuine, but the vehicles the postal worker noticed were not Swiss, and the individuals operating observation equipment on that hillside were not conducting a Swiss federal investigation. The question of who they were, and under whose authority they operated, is a thread that runs through every serious examination of this case, and it will not resolve cleanly until we reach the classified archives discovered nearly 5 decades later. For now, note only this. Within months of Billy Meier's first documented event, unknown external observers had established surveillance positions in the fields outside Hinwil. They were watching the same skies he was watching. They were photographing the same locations he was photographing. The difference was that they didn't want anyone to know they were there. To understand why Western intelligence agencies would take any interest whatsoever in a one-armed Swiss farmer who claimed to photograph alien spacecraft, you need to understand the specific paranoia of the mid-1970s Cold War intelligence environment. The world in 1975 and 1976 was not at peace. It was in a state of carefully managed tension between 2 nuclear superpowers who had each concluded, independently, that the other was capable of developing technology that would be indistinguishable from magic, stealth aircraft, satellite surveillance, directed energy weapons, hypersonic delivery systems. The gap between publicly known technology and classified reality had become enormous, so enormous that the line between a genuine, extraordinary capability and a Soviet deception operation had become, for intelligence analysts, genuinely blurry. Anomalous aerial phenomena had been classified as a dual-threat problem since the late 1940s. The primary concern was Soviet. Any unexplained object seen over Western Europe or North America could represent classified Soviet technology. The secondary concern was domestic. Mass sightings of unexplained aircraft could cause public panic, military miscalculation, or, most dangerously, premature disclosure of classified Western technology if the military was forced to explain what people had seen. Both threats required monitoring. Both required containment. Against this backdrop, a case like Meier's represented a very specific kind of problem. He was not reporting a single, fleeting, ambiguous sighting. He was reporting repeated, sustained, documented encounters in a consistent geographic location. He was producing physical evidence, photographs, circular depressions in the soil, scorched vegetation at landing sites that could not be immediately dismissed. And he was doing this with increasing openness, inviting investigators to examine his evidence, encouraging publication, building a public following. This was, from an intelligence management perspective, exactly the scenario that required early, decisive intervention. Declassified summaries from this period, released in heavily redacted form through various freedom of information processes, confirm that Western agencies maintained active monitoring files on civilian contact claims that demonstrated specific characteristics, repeated sightings in a fixed location, physical trace evidence, photographic documentation, and civilian investigator involvement. The Meier case met every single criterion. An internal classification label that appears in at least 2 separate intelligence summaries, designation stripped, authoring agency redacted, reads simply, persistent contact claim, civilian source. The notation that follows is partially obscured by redaction, but the visible text includes the phrase requires narrative management, which is, in intelligence terminology, not an instruction to investigate. It is an instruction to control. Lieutenant Colonel Wendell C. Stevens was not the kind of man who chased fantasies. He had spent 20 years in the United States Air Force, serving in roles that required both technical competence and high-level clearance. His assignments touched on aerial reconnaissance and the analysis of exotic aerial phenomena at a time when those files were among the most classified in existence. He retired from active duty in 1963, and by the early 1970s had become one of the most respected civilian researchers in his field, respected specifically because of his methodological rigour and his refusal to accept evidence that failed to meet military-grade analytical standards. When Stevens first heard about the Meier photographs in 1976, his initial response was dismissive. Another Swiss mystic, he told an associate, another farmer who saw something strange and built a mythology around it. But then he saw the photographs. Stevens travelled to Switzerland in 1976 and again in 1977. He spent extended time with Meier, interviewing him over dozens of sessions, examining his original film negatives, walking the contact sites, speaking with local witnesses. He brought with him a network of professional contacts in the aerospace and photographic industries who could provide technical analysis that met evidentiary standards. What he found over 2 years of investigation was, by his own account, the most physically substantive contact case he had ever encountered. His analysis of the original negatives, craft in the images, his analysis concluded, exhibited characteristics of genuine three-dimensional objects photographed at genuine distance. Stevens published his findings in 1982 in a book-length investigation that laid out his methodology, his evidence, and his conclusions with the careful, structured clarity of a military intelligence report. He stopped short of declaring Meier's account entirely factual. He was too disciplined for categorical claims, but he stated unambiguously that the evidence taken as a whole could not be explained by conventional means. The response was immediate, coordinated, and, to anyone paying close attention, deeply peculiar in its efficiency. Within months of Stevens's publication, a comprehensive debunking campaign appeared across multiple media outlets in multiple countries nearly simultaneously. Mainstream newspapers in the United States, United Kingdom, and West Germany ran dismissive articles citing unnamed photographic experts. Television programs ran segments in which critics demonstrated how small models on strings could, under certain conditions, produce photographs vaguely similar to Meier's. Research organisations that had previously expressed cautious interest in the case publicly reversed their positions. The coordination was striking, not because any single piece of it was impossible. Negative media coverage of unusual claims was common, but because of the speed, the breadth, the simultaneity. Investigative media campaigns, even well-resourced ones, take time to organise. Editors need to be briefed, journalists need to write, publications need to schedule. A campaign that unfolds across 4 countries in 3 languages within weeks of an inconvenient publication does not happen organically. Stevens noticed this. He wrote about it in private correspondence. He mentioned it in interviews. Nobody in the mainstream press found it worth discussing. The specific mechanism of the debunking campaign is worth examining carefully because it reveals something important about how the suppression of uncomfortable information actually works in practice. It does not work through direct denial. Direct denial draws attention and invites investigation. If a government agency had simply said Billy Meier is lying, the natural journalistic response would have been to ask how they knew. and what evidence they had, and why they cared enough to say so at all. Instead, the campaign operated through what might be called selective evidentiary focus. Among the hundreds of photographs in Meier's collection, critics selected approximately 8 to 10 images and subjected those specific images to aggressive scrutiny. They found, in some cases, elements that could be interpreted as consistent with model photography, a slightly unusual grain pattern here, a reflection artifact there. On the strength of these selected images, the entire body of evidence was declared fraudulent. The logical flaw in this approach is elementary. Disproving or casting doubt on 8 photographs from a collection of several hundred does not disprove the remaining photographs. It proves only that 8 photographs may be problematic. The rest remain exactly as unexplained as they were before. But that logical flaw was never pointed out in mainstream coverage, because mainstream coverage was not constructed around logic. It was constructed around narrative, and the narrative was clean, satisfying, and final. Mistaken farmer, flawed photos, case closed. The public accepted it with the grateful relief that people typically feel when a complicated and unsettling thing is suddenly explained away. Nobody had to worry anymore. There was a normal explanation, the experts had figured it out, except the experts had not figured it out. They had simply focused their attention on the smallest possible slice of the evidence until they found something questionable, and then declared victory while the rest of the evidence quietly continued to resist explanation in laboratories and research institutions that the cameras never visited. This pattern, selective focus, narrative conclusion, public reassurance, is not accidental. It is a method. And it appears, when you examine the historical record of aerial anomaly case management across the second half of the 20th century, with a consistency that suggests institutional design rather than coincidental repetition. Parallel to the photographic evidence, and in some ways more significant, if less immediately dramatic, was the body of written material that Meier produced over the course of his contact years. Beginning in 1975, Meier kept detailed written records of every encounter he claimed to have, with Semjase and subsequently with other individuals who he said identified themselves as members of the same cultural group. These records, eventually published collectively under the title The Contact Notes, run to thousands of pages of transcribed conversations, philosophical discourse, technical description, and what can only be described as prophetic statement. The prophetic content is the portion that most quickly catches the attention of modern readers, and for good reason. Within conversations allegedly recorded between 1975 and 1978, the Contact Notes contain references to the progressive degradation of Earth's natural ecosystems due to industrial pollution and resource extraction, specific to the destabilization of ocean temperatures, the emergence of increasingly extreme weather events as a consequence of atmospheric disruption, rising political instability across the Middle Eastern region centered on resource conflict and territorial disputes, the development of global surveillance infrastructure through civilian technology, particularly communication devices, that individuals would voluntarily carry on their persons, the consolidation of economic power in increasingly smaller numbers of institutional entities, the emergence of pandemic-scale health crises arising from human encroachment on previously isolated biological environments. Each of these statements, taken alone, might be dismissed as vague enough to apply retrospectively to almost any development. That is the standard objection to prophetic literature, and it is a fair objection. But the Contact Notes are not, on examination, vague. They contain specific technical language. They describe mechanisms, not just events. And they were, in several documented cases, shown to investigators before the events they described took place. Stevens, for one, documented cases in which Meier shared Contact Note material with him during their 1976 and 77 visits that described specific geopolitical developments which subsequently occurred in the early 1980s. Stevens was careful in his documentation precisely because he anticipated the retrospective fitting objection, so he dated and notarized the pre-event showings with the care of a man who understood the evidentiary standards he would eventually need to meet. Whether the Contact Notes represent genuine non-human communication, an extraordinary intuitive mind operating on available information, or something else entirely is a question this investigation declines to answer definitively. What it does note is this: intelligence analysts, as a professional category, are paid specifically to assess the accuracy of information from unusual sources. And at least 3 documented intelligence summaries from the late 1970s referenced the Meier contact notes as material requiring content-level analysis. They were not simply watching to see if he was a nuisance. They were reading what he was writing, and in at least some cases they found it worth archiving. In the mid-2000s, a series of Freedom of Information requests, filed by multiple independent researchers in the United States, the United Kingdom and Canada, began to yield partial, heavily redacted documents relating to Cold War monitoring programs. What emerged, document by document, was a picture of systematic, long-term, multinational monitoring of civilian contact claims that went far beyond anything the agencies involved had previously admitted to publicly. Among the released material, buried in appendices and referenced obliquely in summary documents, were multiple notations relating to a persistent civilian contact claim, Swiss origin, 1975 to 1978. The notations are not detailed. The underlying files, if they still exist, have not been released. But the fact of the monitoring and the fact that this case was tracked, categorized and referenced across multiple summaries over multiple years is documented. And it raises a question that the agencies have never been asked to answer publicly. If the case was clearly a hoax, as mainstream media declared it to be, why was it still being tracked in classified summaries as late as 1981? Hoaxes do not generate multi-year classified monitoring programs. They generate brief memos and case closure. What generates multi-year classified monitoring programs is a situation that remains, from the agency's perspective, unresolved. A situation in which the official public conclusion and the private analytical conclusion are not the same thing. Cold War doctrine included a discipline known as perception management, the deliberate shaping of how civilian populations understood and interpreted events. It was applied to military capability, to political narratives, to presentation of enemy nations, and, crucially, to the management of information that could cause uncontrolled social disruption. Anomalous aerial phenomena fell into this last category, beginning in earnest in the late 1940s, when the volume and credibility of reports reaching military channels made it impossible to simply ignore the question any longer. A classified report produced by a CIA-convened panel of scientists and military officials in 1953, substantially declassified in subsequent decades, included a recommendation that public interest in unusual aerial phenomena should be actively reduced through a campaign of debunking, ridicule, and the encouragement of skeptical public narratives. The goal was not, the panel noted, to resolve the question of what people were seeing. The goal was to prevent uncontrolled public reaction to whatever people were seeing. This distinction is important. The agencies were not in the truth business, they were in the stability business. And stability, in their calculus, required that ordinary people not become convinced that extraordinary things were happening in the skies above their homes without an official explanation being ready and waiting. In this context, a case like Meier's represented not just a local anomaly, but a stress test of the entire management framework. Here was a civilian contact claim that was producing compelling physical evidence, attracting serious investigators, and generating growing public interest, all in a Western European country during a period of heightened Cold War tension. Internal documents from this era suggest that planners had considered, in theoretical terms, what a genuine publicly visible contact event would require in terms of narrative management. Several of those documents appear to reference the Meier case not as a confirmed extraterrestrial event. The agencies never confirmed anything, but as a real-world test of the management, protocols they had spent decades preparing. What is the response time of credulous media when a debunking narrative is introduced? How quickly does public ridicule suppress investigation? How many serious researchers can be dissuaded from continued inquiry through professional pressure alone? These are useful questions if you're preparing for something much larger, and the Cold War intelligence community was, in the 1970s, very quietly preparing for something much larger. The most concrete evidence of external intelligence presence in the Hinwil region during the contact years comes not from declassified documents, which remain, for the most part, heavily redacted, but from the memories of people who lived there. Memory is, of course, an imperfect instrument. It distorts under time and expectation. It fills gaps with inference. These are standard objections to witness testimony, and they are legitimate, but they apply less forcefully when multiple, independent witnesses interviewed separately, decades apart, and without knowledge of one another's accounts, describe the same anomalous events in consistent detail. Among the residents of Hinwil and its surrounding communities, who were interviewed by various researchers between the 1980s and 2000s, a pattern emerges with striking regularity: unmarked helicopters. This detail appears in at least 7 separate witness accounts from the late 1970s, not military-marked helicopters, which would have been explainable and noticed for different reasons. Unmarked, dark-painted, flying low, at times and in patterns inconsistent with agricultural or emergency services operation, equipment on the hills. Multiple witnesses describe, independently, having noticed what appeared to be electronic or optical equipment, positioned on elevated ground with clear sight lines to the flat fields, where Meier's contact events were most frequently documented. Antenna, structures, mounted optics. One retired farmer described what he could only call boxes with small dishes, set up overnight and gone again within days, foreign observers. At least 4 separate accounts describe individuals who are clearly not local, speaking languages that witnesses identified variously as English, French, and an unidentified Eastern European language, moving through the region during the peak contact years. These individuals, when approached by locals, offered vague cover stories: birdwatchers, surveyors, research students. None of their institutional affiliations were verifiable by the people who asked about them. Switzerland's geopolitical neutrality made it, from a multinational intelligence operation perspective, nearly ideal. No single nation had jurisdiction. The oversight frameworks that would have applied to similar operations on treaty member territory did not apply in the same way. And the Swiss domestic security apparatus, while professional and capable, had no particular mandate to scrutinise the activities of foreign observers conducting apparent civilian research. The region around Hinwil was, in the late 1970s, a quiet space in a geopolitically advantageous location where multiple external agencies could observe the same events without being required to share their conclusions with one another or with the host nation. It was, in a specific and careful sense, perfect. Among the physical evidence Meier produced during the contact years, the audio recordings occupy a particular place of interest because they have, over 4 decades of analysis, consistently resisted dismissal in a way that even some of his critics have privately acknowledged. Beginning in 1975, Meier claimed to have made audio recordings of the craft associated with his contact events. These recordings were made on a standard consumer-grade portable cassette recorder, the technology most Swiss households would have used in that era for ordinary purposes like recording music or family conversations. The recordings were analysed initially in the late 1970s by a small number of independent audio engineers, some of whom had backgrounds in aerospace acoustics and military sonar. Their findings were cautious but consistent. The recordings contained frequencies and modulation patterns that did not match any known civilian or commercial aircraft of the period. The sounds were not helicopter rotor wash, not propeller aircraft, not jet engine output. They occupied frequency ranges that were, at the time of analysis, not associated with any documented propulsion technology in the public record. This finding was noted and then largely set aside, as the debunking campaign successfully shifted public focus away from evidence examination and toward the more photogenic question of whether small models could be suspended on fishing line. But the audio recordings continued to be analysed, quietly, by individuals working outside the mainstream research context, engineers and acousticians who encountered the recordings as technical curiosities rather than ideologically loaded evidence. In the 2000s, a former aerospace engineer who had spent decades working on advanced propulsion system acoustics reviewed the Meier audio recordings. His analysis, shared in an independent technical forum, noted something that he found genuinely puzzling. The frequency modulation characteristics in the recordings bore significant similarity to acoustic signatures associated with experimental electromagnetic propulsion concepts that had only begun to receive serious engineering attention in the 1990s and 2000s. In other words, the sounds on the recordings resembled propulsion technologies that, as far as the public record shows, did not exist as engineering concepts until 15 to 20 years after the recordings were made. The most uncomfortable possible explanation that what Meier recorded was an operational form of technology that humanity, in the conventional public sense, had not yet developed, is the one that no mainstream outlet has ever discussed. It remains sitting in the technical literature like a quiet, unanswered question. In the late autumn of 1978, something changed in the Meier contact record, abruptly, without a gradual tapering, without a period of reduced frequency that might suggest natural end of interest. The large-scale, publicly documented sightings around Hinwil simply stopped. Meier's explanation, as recorded in the contact notes, was that the extraterrestrial individual known as Semyase had sustained an injury during an unspecified encounter and had been withdrawn from active contact. He expressed distress at this in his writings, not the clinical distress of a man managing a public narrative, but the personal distress of someone who had lost access to something he considered genuinely important to his life. The external record around this same period is suggestive in ways that do not resolve cleanly in either direction. The frequency of reported aerial anomaly sightings in the Hinwil region, tracked independently by Swiss civilian skywatchers and noted in local records, declined significantly in the same period. The unmarked vehicles that local residents had noticed near Meier's contact sites disappeared. The hillside equipment positions were, as best as investigators can determine, no longer occupied. Researchers who have studied this period note a coincidence worth examining. In late 1978, classified space-based reconnaissance capability had significantly upgraded satellite coverage of Western European airspace. The need for ground-based monitoring in neutral territory would have diminished correspondingly. And perhaps the contact events themselves, whatever their source, had provided whatever data they were going to provide. The timing of the end is, if nothing else, interesting. Not gradual, not ambiguous. An abrupt cessation that coincides, within months, with the end of the most intensive period of external surveillance, the debunking campaign reaching its conclusion, and classified satellite coverage of the region improving dramatically. Coincidences accumulate until they stop being coincidences. The question is always how many you are prepared to hold simultaneously before the weight of them forces a different kind of conclusion. Lena Weiss was 34 years old when she first encountered a reference to the Meier case in a context that had nothing to do with the question of extraterrestrial life. She was a journalist based in Zurich, working primarily in the field of Cold War historical documentation, specifically the reconstruction of intelligence operations that had been conducted on Swiss soil during the 1960s, 70s and 80s. It was precise methodical work that required mastery of 4 languages, facility with archival research across multiple national systems, and a tolerance for years-long projects that might ultimately yield nothing publishable. She was good at it. She had published 2 well-regarded investigations, one into Cold War intelligence entanglements within Swiss financial institutions, and one into the quiet use of Swiss neutrality for multinational signals monitoring operations, that had earned her a reputation for documentary rigour respected across the European investigative journalism community. The reference she encountered was buried in a NATO signal monitoring summary from 1977, a document she had located through a partially successful Freedom of Information request to the Belgian National Archives, which held certain administrative documents from the era. The summary, which concerned aerial signal monitoring over Western European airspace during a specific series of dates in 1977, contained a notation she did not initially understand. It referenced Swiss aerial anomaly events, fixed geographic origin, civilian source, and cross-referenced a file number that appeared in the same summary in association with intelligence monitoring of what the document called persistent contact claim activity. She spent 3 days tracing the cross-reference before concluding that it almost certainly related to the documented Meier case, which she knew only vaguely from its cultural afterlife as a dismissed story. Most journalists would have set the notation aside at that point. It was a tangent from her main research thread, associated with a topic that carries sufficient social ridicule to damage professional reputations even when treated with careful rigour. The rational calculus argued strongly for moving on. Lena Sayers was not good at moving on from things that did not add up. She travelled to Hinwil on a grey February morning, almost, exactly, 48 years after the morning Billy Meier had driven his moped out to that field in 1975. The farmland was as she had imagined it, quiet, ordered, indifferent to significance. The hills where the witnesses had described observation equipment were wooded now, grown over with the unhurried persistence of vegetation reclaiming ground that human attention had briefly occupied and then abandoned. The original contact sites were identifiable only through Meier's own documentation. Nothing in the landscape itself marked them as extraordinary. She found the witnesses reluctant to speak. Some of the early investigators she attempted to contact were unwilling to revisit the topic. The reluctance was not hostile. It was the specific reluctance of people who had, at some point in the past, been burned for their willingness to engage with a subject that the broader culture had designated as socially hazardous. They had learned their lesson. They had moved on. They did not want to unlearn it. The investigation that Weiss conducted over the following 18 months was, in its methodology, entirely consistent with her previous work. She treated the Meier case not as an inquiry into extraterrestrial life, but as a Cold War intelligence history, a case of monitoring, management and information control applied to a civilian individual whose activities had attracted institutional attention. This framing allowed her to approach the evidence without the ideological loading that typically distorts both believers and debunkers when they engage with this subject. She was not interested in whether Meier had really photographed alien spacecraft. She was interested in what the intelligence record showed about who had been watching him, why, and what they had concluded. The pattern she eventually mapped was more complex than she had initially anticipated. She obtained, through a combination of Freedom of Information requests and archival research across 5 national archives, a partial but coherent picture of the external monitoring operation around Hinwil. The monitoring was not conducted by a single agency. It was, she concluded, a loose collaboration between at least 3 Western intelligence entities, coordinating through informal channels rather than formal treaty structures, precisely because the informal arrangement allowed each participant to maintain plausible deniability about the nature and conclusions of the operation. She then compared the timeline of documented Meier sightings against the timeline of classified aerospace development programs that have been partially declassified in the decades since. The overlap she found was not simple or clean. It never is in genuine archival research, but it was significant. Several of the peak periods of Meier's documented contact events corresponded to known periods of intensive classified aerospace testing in Western Europe. Programs involving experimental propulsion concepts, atmospheric research platforms, and early satellite positioning system tests that required specific geographic triangulation from ground points. She was careful not to overstate this. Correlation is not causation. Overlap in timeline does not prove relationship. But it raised a hypothesis she found genuinely uncomfortable, that at least some of what Meier was documenting and what the intelligence community was monitoring was classified human technology being tested in the Swiss airspace corridor, alongside whatever else might or might not have been occurring. This meant, if her hypothesis was correct, that the agencies monitoring the situation had an additional reason for aggressive narrative management beyond the standard protocols. They needed to prevent civilian investigators from cataloguing classified aerospace assets that happened to be operating in the same airspace where Meier's alleged contacts were taking place. The cover story of a dismissed hoax served 2 purposes simultaneously. It discredited the civilian witness, and it obscured whatever else was in the air. Among the documents Weiss eventually located was an internal communication, origin agency still classified, dated 1979, that laid out, in terms more explicit than anything previously available in the public record, the principle underlying the narrative management approach applied to cases like Meier's. The document is partially redacted. What remains visible includes a passage that, translated from the original bureaucratic language, states approximately the following. The most effective mechanism for preventing sustained civilian investigation of sensitive aerial phenomena is not denial, which invites further inquiry, but ridicule. Ridicule activates social enforcement mechanisms independent of official action. Once a subject is publicly associated with irrationality, credible investigators self-select out of engagement. Institutional funding becomes unavailable, and peer pressure among journalists and academics sustains the dismissal without requiring further resource expenditure from managing entities. Read that again slowly. The most effective mechanism is not denial, it is ridicule. Because ridicule activates social enforcement mechanisms independent of official action. This is not speculation. This is a documented institutional principle found in a partially declassified government document describing the deliberate use of social dynamics to suppress investigation without requiring direct governmental involvement. The agencies did not need to threaten journalists. They did not need to confiscate evidence. They did not need to silence witnesses through legal action. All they needed to do was ensure that the initial public narrative frame was ridicule, and then human social psychology did the rest, automatically, sustainably, essentially for free. Weiss recognized this pattern from her previous work. She had seen it applied to the Swiss banking investigations, the initial dismissal of investigators as conspiracy theorists, the social pressure on journalists who pursued the story, the eventual official acknowledgement that came only after the institutions involved had had sufficient time to manage the damage. The mechanism was identical. The scale was different. The subject was different. The mechanism was identical. Billy Meier had not been defeated by evidence. He had been defeated by a social technology that was, by 1979, well developed, institutionally understood, and deliberately applied. The question of what actually happened in those Swiss fields remained, as it had always remained, unanswered. The deepest layer of the archival evidence Weiss uncovered is also, appropriately, the most ambiguous. It comes from a single, partially declassified briefing document, its origin agency designated only by a two-letter code that does not correspond to any publicly known agency designation, dated 1981. The document appears to be a summary briefing, prepared for a senior official, of conclusions reached after 5 or more years of monitoring the Meier case. It is written in the careful conditional language of institutional analysis, every claim hedged, every conclusion preceded by phrases like available evidence suggests, or cannot be excluded that. It is, in short, exactly the kind of document that a senior intelligence analyst would produce when reporting on a situation where certainty was unavailable and the stakes of being wrong were very high. Most of the document remains redacted. What is visible runs to approximately 1,200 words in the original language, of which perhaps 800 have been translated and shared in the research literature. The visible text contains the following assessment. It cannot be excluded that the contact events documented by the civilian source represent a deliberate managed disclosure protocol originating from an intelligence of non-human origin, designed not to transfer specific information, but to assess the response capabilities of governing institutions when confronted with undeniable physical evidence presented through a single low-credibility civilian channel. Pause on that for a moment. Not to transfer specific information, to assess the response capabilities of governing institutions, the hypothesis being entertained by senior intelligence analysts in a classified briefing document in 1981 is that the Meier contact events were not random. They were a test, and the subject being tested was not Billy Meier. It was us, humanity, specifically the institutions through which humanity governs itself. The question being asked, according to this interpretation, when presented with undeniable physical evidence of non-human contact through a single civilian channel, a channel specifically selected for its vulnerability to ridicule, what does humanity do? The answer, delivered by the 1979 debunking campaign, was, it suppresses, ridicules, and forgets. Whether the extraterrestrial intelligence implied by this hypothesis actually exists, whether the briefing document is authentic, and whether the analysis it contains reflects genuine intelligence conclusions or elaborate speculation, are questions that cannot be resolved with available evidence. What can be said is this: someone, at some level of the Cold War intelligence apparatus, was considering this possibility seriously enough to include it in a classified briefing summary prepared for a senior official. In the world of intelligence analysis, what gets briefed to senior officials is not wild speculation. It is the most serious assessment of available evidence that the analyst can produce. Among the later contact notes materials, those produced in the early 1980s, after the period of peak public activity had ended and the mainstream media had long since moved on, there is a passage that has attracted less attention than it deserves. It is attributed, as always, to the communications transmitted through the contact framework established with Semjei and her colleagues. It is written in the careful, somewhat formal style that characterises all of the contact notes, not colloquial, not rhetorical, but deliberately precise in a way that sometimes reads as alien not because of its subject matter, but because of its register. In translation, it states approximately the following: the current phase of contact is concluding not because information transfer is complete, but because the observable stability of the receiving civilization is insufficient for the next phase of open interaction. The required threshold is not technological. It has been established that the technological capacity will develop according to observable trajectory. The required threshold is institutional and psychological, the capacity to receive confirmation of non-human intelligence without fracturing the social structures through which the civilization coordinates collective response. That threshold has not been reached. Contact will resume when it has. This passage was written, according to the contact notes dating, in 1982. The date of the last large-scale publicly documented Meier sighting cluster aligns within a margin of a few months with the same period. Whether this alignment means anything at all depends on what you believe about the source of the contact notes. If they are genuine transmissions from non-human intelligence, a position that requires accepting premises most rational people are not prepared to accept, then the alignment is significant. The contact ended because it ended deliberately, by the decision of the contacting party, at the moment the contacting party determined that open engagement was not yet productive. If the notes are Meier's own creation, whether conscious or unconscious synthesis of his intuitions and observations, then the alignment means that he was aware enough of what was happening around him to write a conclusion that fit the observable facts with uncomfortable precision. Either interpretation is, in its own way, interesting. The gap between them is where this case has always lived. Vice published her investigation to a response that was, as she had perhaps expected, a smaller-scale mirror of the 1979 debunking campaign. Credulous outlets embraced her findings without the nuance she intended. Mainstream press dismissed the investigation without engaging with its archival sourcing. Several academic colleagues who had previously expressed respect for her work quietly distanced themselves. The institutions she had named, not as guilty parties but as documented participants in a management operation, remained silent. The silence, she noted in a subsequent interview, was the most informative response she received. Organisations that have nothing to hide do not strategically decline to respond to specific archival documentation. They issue corrections or clarifications, or they invite the researcher to review additional material. They engage. The silence was the engagement. She did not claim, in her investigation, that Billy Meier had been visited by extraterrestrial intelligence. She claimed only what the documents showed, that he had been monitored, that the monitoring had been extensive and multinational, that the debunking campaign had been coordinated in ways that documentary evidence supported, and that at least one senior intelligence analyst had, in a classified briefing document, entertained the possibility that the contact events represented a deliberate protocol from non-human intelligence designed to measure humanity's institutional response. She presented the evidence. She laid out the methodology. She invited examination. The silence held. There is a specific kind of loneliness that attaches to the Billy Meier case. a loneliness that has nothing to do with whether his encounters were real. It is the loneliness of being the canary in the coal mine at a moment when the institutions managing the mine have decided that the public is better served by not knowing about the coal. Meier spent the 1970s walking out into Swiss fields with a camera and a notebook, and a stubborn conviction that what he was experiencing was important enough to document. He invited scrutiny. He preserved his evidence. He answered investigators' questions for decades, without the kind of self-protective withdrawal that guilt or calculation might have produced. The response he received, from the institutions he could see and from the institutions he could not, was a systematic, professionally managed exercise in making him not worth taking seriously, and it worked. For most people. For most of the public. For most of the time. But it did not work on everyone. It never does. There are always the investigators who read the technical analysis, the archivists who find the classified notations, the journalists who cross-reference the NATO summaries, the engineers who listen to the audio recordings and realise that the frequencies do not match anything that should have existed in 1975. These individuals do not form a community of believers. They form a community of people who find that the official account does not satisfy the evidence, and who are professionally or personally unable to simply set the discrepancy aside. Perhaps the Billy Meier case was never meant to convince everyone. Perhaps it was never meant to convince anyone in the conventional sense of settled, demonstrable, institutionally ratified truth. Perhaps, and this is the hypothesis that the classified briefing document of 1981 suggests, and that nothing in the subsequent 4 decades has convincingly ruled out, it was meant only to measure something. To measure how humanity responds when the impossible appears in plain sight, in broad daylight, photographed with a consumer camera by a one-armed Swiss farmer who had no motive for invention beyond a deep and documented conviction that what he was experiencing was real. The measurement, as far as the available evidence suggests, was taken. The result was recorded, and somewhere in an archive that has not yet been declassified, in a briefing document that has not yet been released, there may be a conclusion about us, about our readiness, about what happens next, that is waiting for a civilization stable enough to hear it.